So, first of all, thank you everyone for attending our third installment of our leadership series, Making High Dose Tutoring a Smart Investment. Certainly an incredibly timely discussion on funding and value at this moment. I do want to take a moment to introduce myself and Tutor.com. My name is John Calvello, Chief Institutional Officer at Tutor.com and the Princeton Review. Tutor.com has been providing academic tutoring for over 25 years, doing work in K-12, higher education, libraries, government institutions, and have completed over 28 million unique one-to-one tutoring sessions to date, and that number is always climbing. And finally, proud to state that we've received our tutoring design badge from National Student Support Accelerator for alignment to high impact standards. But without further ado, let's jump into our session today. So we can jump to the next slide and we can talk about our agenda before we jump in. So for today's session, really want to bring together themes from our first two sessions as we think about high dosage tutoring strategy and implementation, and how all those things factor into value against an education landscape with funding uncertainty. So we're going to start by setting the stage, looking at the current state of funding within K-12. And then we're really going to focus primarily on two key themes, right? So the first is going to be focus on value. So what does the research show about high dosage tutoring? What does that impact look like? And how do we determine the value of a high dose tutoring program? What does that return on investment look like? And then the second key area is really looking at data or district insights, right? So what does implementing a high dosage tutoring program look like in reality, right? When you're confronted with unique implementations, budgets, on-site coordinations, doing all that work to drive value. So what we'll do is we can jump to the next slide and I can finally introduce the wonderful panel that we have here today. Honored to be joined by the panel of experts to help us define what value in high dose tutoring looks like. I know it's a lot of work, so I certainly appreciate all of your time and commitment to having this discussion today. So let me go through and introduce our panelists. We have Jess Sobin. She is the High Impact Tutoring Director at OSSE, DC State Education Agency. Jess leads DC's High Impact Tutoring Initiative, which scales evidence-based tutoring programs to accelerate learning for students across the district. Introduce Dr. Matthew Steinberg, an economist and managing director of research and evaluation at Accelerate. And finally, Dr. Nathan Storey, researcher and evaluation analyst at Johns Hopkins University School of Education Center for Research and Reform in Education. Again, I want to thank all the panelists for your time in our conversation today. All right, so let's jump into the first slide that we have. And I really want to start this session by recapping what we covered in a previous webinar, right? How to build a high dosage tutoring strategy that works. So to set the stage for our conversation around research and value, I just want to review the key characteristics of a high dosage tutoring program, right? There are six, key components that really go into high dosage tutoring, right? So that first has to be a high frequency program where you're working with students at a minimum of 3 times per week, and you're working with those students in small group instruction, up to 4 students in a group. That way, there's really the ability for that tutor to work closely with those students, make that connection, and really differentiate that instruction. Additionally, the tutoring has to be curriculum driven and tailored and aligned with state standards. That way, the provider and the district are in lockstep of what they are covering and working with students to get the gains that they're really looking to achieve. Certainly, it has to be assessment based. That way we can ensure the work is moving towards efficacy and impact. And finally, it has to be consistent and relational. And I think this is such an important piece, really making sure you have a wonderful tutor that can connect with students, make them feel comfortable, build that rapport, and really work with students to unblock areas where they're stuck and to motivate those students. So really the key characteristics of tutoring that's really going to sit at the backdrop of our conversation today. So now if we move on to the next slide, we know what high dosage tutoring looks like, right? What does the funding landscape look like to implement this type of intervention program? Certainly 5 years after the pandemic, the need remains, right? Learning gaps continue to persist, especially in math and ELA. And we also know that high-dosage tutoring remains one of the most effective interventions to combat those learning gaps. So the gaps continue to persist, but the funding doesn't, right? We are in a post-ESSER reality, right? So if I think back over the years, past 3 to 5 years, I've attended so many sessions about, the funding cliff, the ESSER funding cliff, and now it's here, right? So certainly those one-time funds for ESSER have expired, right? So that is really the end. And now we're seeing a lot of that has shifted to the state level, which is great. There are a lot of states that have dedicated grants and dollars to support tutoring, which is wonderful. But districts are still in a tough place around making decisions to sustain tutoring and intervention programs or find ways to launch new ones. If we move to the next slide, we can really take a look at some of the funding sources that exists and what that means for districts. Certainly, title funding can be used for academic tutoring. There was a lot of uncertainty earlier, in the summer, but a lot of districts have at this point sort of understand what it means to have their title funding. As I mentioned, there's lots of state allocations across the US that schools can tap into, which is a wonderful resource. And most recently, we've seen grants for the education, innovation, and research programs really designed to implement evidence-based programs to improve student achievement for high-need students. And then certainly districts have to make tough choices, right? Is there in a deficit year? What is a nice to have versus something that is essential? So all of this really goes a long way to say that every tutoring dollar that we have has to drive value. So incredibly important for us to do that. So you move to the next slide. I think we're going to talk about the 3 key questions that we want to answer in today's conversation, right? We know it's so important to make sure we have the right program and it maximizes that value. And so we need to ask these 3 questions, right? What defines a high dosage tutoring program? How do districts evaluate effectiveness and ROI of those programs? And then what does value look like in a real world implementation? Right. So these are things that we want to solve today. So I can finally bring our panel into this discussion so we can jump to the next slide. And so I want to reintroduce Dr. Nathan Storey, education researcher, Center for Research and Reform in Education at Johns Hopkins University School of Education, and Dr. Matthew Steinberg, Managing Director of Research and Evaluation at Accelerate. So bring both of you into this conversation at this point. We know that, with the backdrop of a high dosage tutoring program looks like, against the current funding environment, the most important question now is the value of high dose tutoring and how to implement those programs. So 2 questions that come to mind. What does the research show us about the impact of high dosage tutoring? And what is that ROI, right? What is that return on an educational investments? So Nathan, let's start with you. Does high dosage tutoring improve student achievements and what does the research show us?
Hi, so yes, thank you. When we talk about value or the value of a program or an intervention, as John was saying, the first thing we are thinking about and questioning in the education setting, at least, is does it work? And so this is a question that we ask a lot through program evaluations and in the work that our center does with evidence for ESSA and proven tutoring, which some of you may be familiar with. And so to have value, we're arguing that an intervention, a tutoring intervention, curriculum reform, school vision program, any of these school-based interventions in the education setting, they work because they improve student learning. They improve literacy skills, math skills, they improve some other metric that we are interested in and hoping to improve. We want to assess whether their academic skills are stronger by the end of the program than they were at the start, compared to others who did not get the intervention, or whether their lives or academic careers are stronger as a result of the program. So if we can go to the next slide. We want to zoom out for this high-level overview of what we already know about programs that work. And that is that the evidence increasingly confirms that, on average, high-dosage tutoring improves student achievement more than other educational interventions. And if you click again, I think you'll get there we go. And so we know that this is in relation to other programs such as class reductions to class size, summer school, other curricular reforms. And as you can see in this figure, the effect sizes for high dosage tutoring interventions, as determined by multiple meta-analyses, ranges from about 0.29 to 0.42 standard deviations. And of a subset of those, meta-analyses that focus on large randomized control trials suggest that the effect size is around 0.20 standard deviations. And so for reference, that's in education, those are strong effect sizes. In other contexts, they might be considered small or medium, but in education, those stand out. And they contrast noticeably with the effect sizes found for these other intervention types that you can see in this figure. I do want to foreshadow as we're moving forward that there's variation between tutoring programs and that not all models are equal or have equal impact, and not all evidence is equal. So if you click to the next slide. So, if we know that high dosage tutoring is on average most effective or proven, we should also consider how we know that, how we determine a program has evidence of effectiveness. So the ESSER created these 4 tiers of evidence, which you can see on this screen. And they're intended to differentiate the types of research and evidence that can indicate how reliable findings from research of program effectiveness may be. Typically, when we say that a program is proven or has evidence, we mean that they have at least one study that demonstrates impact at tier 1 or tier 2, and sometimes we would say that tier 3 data is evidence, or is useful evidence for this discussion. This means, when we're talking about these tiers, this means that there was a study that meets certain criteria. Most importantly, the study would have included a treatment and comparison groups that were compared to one another, with one not receiving the intervention, with one of those groups not receiving the intervention, and the 2 groups need to have been established as being statistically similar at baseline, that is prior to students receiving any tutoring, for instance. And the sample of students in both groups must meet certain size levels for us to be able to say that we have enough power to detect the actual effect that we want to see from the intervention. Next slide, please. So these studies often result in different figures or means of identifying whether a program worked, based on the actual tests that are used to measure learning or whichever outcome we're interested in. Some common ones in education settings include the DIBELS, the NWEA MAP assessment, even survey results. The actual test or measure can be many different things. And then we would then use those findings to create these different figures or means of looking at the effect. I mentioned effect size earlier, and these are the most common form of describing effectiveness that you have probably seen. Another measure you might see is estimates of years or months of learning gained for those who received the tutoring or other treatment intervention. And we calculate that by converting effect size into this new figure of additional gain of learning. Yet another measure is tutoring efficiency, which you can see in this figure is a measure of the estimate of number of hours of tutoring needed to improve student learning by 1 month. So it's also based on this calculation that we do based on effect size, months of growth. And these estimates are all useful in allowing us to compare different types of programs. They could be comparing things as different as tutoring versus curriculum reform or summer school, as in that first figure I showed, but also different models of programs, one-on-one versus small group tutoring, virtual versus in-person tutoring, specific tutoring programs or models that use different curricular materials. And as I said, this example here depicts the tutoring efficiency measures for 3 different programs. And interestingly, we have to be careful how we interpret these things. And so while for effect size or months of learning gained, we would look for the study with the highest number. But in the case of this tutoring efficiency figure, it's worth noting that the higher the number, the less efficient. So program A here is the most efficient, providing 1 month of growth based on just 16 hours of tutoring, whereas program B and C take more tutoring hours. So these are measures that are useful in comparison, but also understanding specific programs. And if we go to the next slide, these measures of effectiveness are definitely useful in helping to determine whether a program works and therefore is valuable, as we're discussing today. But each estimate also comes with certain assumptions and qualifications. Effect sizes are often seen as definitive. They are standardized estimates, but they are subject to bias, as with all research. For instance, publication bias means that statistically significant findings are given priority in journals over non-significant results, which impacts the available data that we have for meta-analyses. we take that into account with the meta-analyses, but that's an issue if there's not a lot out there. Smaller studies, due to lower power for statistical calculations, often report larger effect sizes, as the study may not be able to detect the true effect. And so essentially the conclusions that we glean and can glean from reviewing existing data are only as strong as the underlying research. And as researchers and consumers of research, we have to do our best to either ensure, if we're the authors, or ascertain if we're reviewing a study, whether the findings are reliable and generalizable. And even when these estimates allow for accurate comparisons of programs or models, they don't necessarily tell us the whole story of a program or a model and how it would work in different contexts. For school leaders to make the most informed decisions related to program adoption or when cutting and balancing budgets, additional dimensions of value should also be considered. And so on that note, I will turn it over to Dr. Steinberg.
Thank you, Nathan. No, I appreciate it. I think it's great to know that high-dosage tutoring works, right? I think we can see that impact. And so now the question is, what other considerations do we just need to think about beyond simply just the impact?
Thanks, John. Thanks, Nathan. So I think the transition point here, and John alluded to this in his, I think, really, really excellent framing up front, was, we're in a climate that's highly resource constrained. We're in a post-ESSER funding climate. We know that there's been contractions of not just the funding that resulted from the ESSER cliff and the cessation of the federal fiscal stimulus, but also other federal constraints around support. And so the question now is, given the academic need, right? We've all seen the 2024 NAEP scores. We've all seen the more recent 12th grade NAEP scores. And we're at the lowest level of academic achievement in almost 3 decades. 2 out of 3 students in grades 4 through 8 aren't reading or doing math on grade level. This is an existential crisis in our educational system, in, frankly, our stock of human capital and skills among our students. So the question is, if tutoring can improve student achievement, at what dollar, right, is the investment in tutoring worth it? Next slide. So as I just mentioned, program impact information, as Nathan was describing, is necessary. We need to know if a program works, right? But we also need to know more about that program to determine whether it is a good and sound investment for district leaders and others who are making decisions about different intervention models, particularly different tutoring providers. And so in this post-pandemic climate that we're in, that, as I mentioned, is marked by not just sustained declines in student achievement, and really, again, historic levels of student or low levels of student achievement, but also the end of federal fiscal stimulus. The question of does it work is a necessary, though no longer sufficient question that we should be asking as policymakers, researchers, practitioners, school leaders about our educational investments, right? So the impact of a program, as Nathan described really clearly, I think, which can be measured by effect sizes or months of learning, or this tutoring efficiency measure that I came up with at Accelerate, right, doesn't tell the entire story, right? Because there's likely, and we know there's lots of program-specific differences in what it costs to implement the program. Estimates from colleagues at NSSA out of Stanford indicate that high-dosage tutoring programs can range from $1,000 per pupil upwards of $3,000 per pupil. And we know that there are some in-person models that can be as expensive as $5,000 or $6,000 per pupil. So in a case where a program is really effective but very costly, it may in fact be it's likely less cost effective than a program that is moderately effective but far more reasonable in terms of the costs associated with implementing that program. So is it worth it really is the natural extension of this question of does it work? And we think should really be a focus of policymakers and school leaders when considering which educational interventions to support with, as we described, increasingly limited educational budgets. Next slide. So how then, knowing that we want to try to get some measures of the cost effectiveness or the return on the dollars invested in tutoring interventions and other interventions, how do we go about identifying whether an intervention is worth it or not? Well, to determine whether an educational intervention is worth, again, these very, or increasingly rather, scarce educational dollars, right? We need to know in order to know the value of the program, we need two pieces of information. We need information on program impact. As Nathan described, does the intervention, all else equal, improve student learning outcomes? And second, at what cost, right? We need these two pieces of information to better understand, are we generating value out of every dollar invested in a particular intervention model? So to support this data gathering and this data analysis and insight, at Accelerate, I and a colleague developed a cost analysis tool to support data gathering on program costs. And we've included the link here, and maybe we can include the link in the chat for folks. And all of the resources are open source and publicly available, so as to maximize the reach of this work. So what does this tool, this cost tool, enable users to do? It allows users to identify implementation details, right? Because it very well may be the case, and it is typically the case, that the cost of implementing the same program differs across districts, differs across states, may even differ across schools within the same district, right? Depending on the different levels of school-based supports, right, to support implementation. So we need to know what's the program design, right, in terms of grades served, modality, tutor type, the district location in which the intervention is being implemented, the cost per pupil charged to the school district, right? So all of these are implementation details that the tool supports data gathering around. Second, we need to define what are those inputs. Thanks, Laura. What are those inputs that define the program, or what we might call ingredients? And we're going to be using the ingredients method, which we'll talk about momentarily, right? So what are all of those inputs? Tutor labor, training and materials, right? Professional development supports, etc. Then the tool allows us to price the ingredients. And we can price the ingredients in multiple ways. We can price the ingredients based on what's the average cost of that input, call it tutors, from the implementation setting, from the district or the community in which the intervention is being implemented. What's the average cost if we just looked at national averages? And also, what's the actual cost? To give us a range of cost to see if the actual cost of a given input, is it very different or very similar to what the cost of that input would be if we use local pricing or national pricing. And finally, we gather all of this information, the implementation details, the information on inputs, the price of those inputs, certainly the quantity of those inputs as well, that goes into pricing the inputs, and we create a cost estimate, right? So effectively, we get a cost of what we call the cost to society, which is defined as the cost of all of the inputs, both those inputs that the provider pays for, as well as inputs that may be inputs that the school faces. So for example, if a school is required to dedicate some teacher time or curriculum coordinator support time to implementing an intervention, that's necessarily time that that coordinator or that teacher is not using in other ways, whether it's direct instruction to the school. So really trying to understand all the direct and indirect, or some from Econ 101, you might remember, the opportunity costs of the time necessary for folks to help support and implement an intervention. So the cost to society. And then we use that cost to society and the program impact estimate, as Nathan described, to estimate the return on investment of a school or district's investment in a tutoring initiative. Next slide. So what is this ingredients method that we're using for the cost analysis itself? So as I mentioned, the cost tool, which again is open access, and we welcome folks to open it, play around with it, of course, after the webinar. And please feel free to reach out to me by email if you have any questions or feedback. We're always looking to improve. We've just released a second version of the cost tool last month, so we're always looking to update and improve the tool. Nevertheless, the tool itself leverages the ingredients method to estimate program costs. So the ingredients method is a method developed by Hank Levin and colleagues many years ago, which is effectively itemizing all of the specific inputs that go into a program. We identify the ingredients, we price the ingredients, we can then calculate program costs, both cost to society and then what we also call cost to school, which we define as how much per pupil does a school pay explicitly for a tutoring intervention, plus all of these hidden or opportunity costs, as I mentioned, that are associated with school staff and school personnel time, maybe school facility time, right? So that we can get a measure of the direct and indirect costs to the school faces for implementing a given intervention. And then we've defined 5 program ingredient categories. First is personnel, delivery, and operations. This is typically where the costs of the tutors may be found. And, on average, tutors typically account for anywhere between 60 and 80% of the total cost of implementing an intervention. So certainly the costs are heavily weighted on personnel and particularly tutor costs. Second, we have opportunities to identify inputs and ingredients related to training and support, equipment and materials, facilities, and then other. And again, the tool is flexible enough to allow folks to input other ingredients that may not fit so neatly under these 5 categories. So again, we conduct this cost analysis, we generate a cost to society, which again is the total cost of all inputs, direct and indirect, necessary for implementing an intervention, a tutoring intervention, in a given district or school setting. Again, given that there may be variability across districts and schools in the cost associated with implementation, gather that information and construct a measure of cost effectiveness, which measures, as John was describing, the return on investment, or the ROI, in terms of changes in student learning. And relying again on estimates not just of program impact, but also program cost. And we've defined cost effectiveness. And again, there's other measures of cost effectiveness ratios in the literature. We've tried to define in a way that has a fairly straightforward interpretation for comparative purposes for school leaders and others who are making these procurement decisions around intervention selection. So we define it as the additional months of learning gained by investing $1,000 per pupil, or said another way, the amount of student learning a school can purchase for $1,000 per pupil. And when we say $1,000 per pupil, simply as a norming device, as a way of allowing us to compare across programs that vary quite dramatically in their cost per student. Next slide. So how are we actually going about conducting and implementing the cost tool in the field? Well, beginning this academic year, program-specific cost analysis is formally being incorporated into all program evaluations of tutoring providers that are supported through Accelerate, right? So we have a number of, and we also piloted this in the spring with Nathan and his team at JHU and our partners at SEPR at Harvard, to really give us important feedback so that we can launch this tool widespread in this academic year. And what this tool and the implementation of these cost analyses will enable is a direct assessment of program-specific cost effectiveness, right? Is one program more or less cost-effective compared to another program? Now, again, there's lots of caveats here, which are necessary and important, but we're trying to get as apples to apples as possible, conditional on those caveats, to be able to make, again, procurement decisions with the best available information about program impact and program cost. Right? This information is hopefully going to provide greater clarity into the ROI in terms of student learning of each of Accelerate's grantees. And we hope as the field begins to incorporate this tool and leverage this tool to develop cost analyses of other interventions in the field, tutoring and otherwise, begin to build the evidence base around not just whether these programs, tutoring and other personalized learning interventions for students, improve student learning, but again, what's the return on the dollar invested? So in doing so, we're hoping to offer much needed information for state and district and local leaders like Jess Sobin, who's going to speak in a moment, on the identification and selection of program models that improve student learning and key at the lowest cost, right? We can spend $10,000 per pupil, get the Cadillac version, as my grandfather would say, right? But that version might have a really low ROI. And again, in a very budget constrained environment, this is a key question. So Accelerate is working hard with our external research partners like Nathan and our external district and school leaders like Jess Sobin to support the implementation of this cost tool in the field. Next slide. And so here we've included some resources, including Accelerate's research agenda, a link to the cost tool that was put in the chat, as well as some information from our quarterly research notes that I write every quarter describing our work. And then we've got a link to Proven Tutoring site. Nathan, go ahead, please.
Yes, so a link to the Proven Tutoring site and Evidence for ESSER, and then that QR code is to sign up for the Evidence for ESSER newsletter for anyone who's interested.
Thank you, Dr. Storey. Thank you, Dr. Steinberg. Certainly, this is a critical moment in education. We're at that crossroads of you need to dramatically improve student achievements, but doing it with limited funding or funding uncertainty. So measuring value is absolutely essential. So, Jess, I think this is a perfect time to bring you into this conversation and get your perspective. So we can go to the next slide. So Jess Sobin, High Impact Tutoring Director, DC Office of State Superintendent of Education. So to bring you into this conversation, to get your perspective on impact and cost, since you're on the ground implementing high-dose tutoring, right? So can you provide us with some insights into how you think about high-dosage tutoring and value as you're working with, sites within OSSE about launching and implementing high-dosage tutoring?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, John. And really learned a ton already on this panel from Dr. Storey and Dr. Steinberg. Very excited for those outcomes of the cost analyses this year. But I am particularly excited and honored to be here today to be learning from all of you and contributing to a panel on this topic because at our state education agency in DC, OSSE, we think a lot about cost and value in our high impact tutoring work because it's such a key lever in how many kids we can serve and how much impact we can make, especially when, as everyone has discussed, funding for this work fluctuates a lot and can be very uncertain. So before I jump into talking about the costs of HIT in DC and how we think about them, I'll give you a little bit of a framing for what our HIT work looks like in DC. We call it HIT, High Impact Tutoring. Next slide, 2 slides ahead, actually, please. Thank you. Great. As John said, I've been working on the High Impact Tutoring Initiative here in DC for 4 years, going into my 5th year. In the first 3 years, High Impact Tutoring, the High Impact Tutoring Initiative was a key response to the learning disruptions from the COVID-19 pandemic. The mayor allocated and the city allocated $33 million of funding for 3 years, and that funding came from recovery funds, federal recovery funds, to reach at least 10% of students across the district and to target students who are furthest from opportunity. Like I said, we had this big pot of funds to do that. In the following year, in school year 24-25, those federal funds began to sunset, of course, and but we were fortunate to get an allocation of local funds from the state, from the city, to continue high impact tutoring. And so by the end of last year, we reached close to 17,000 unique students with high impact tutoring, about 15% of our K-12 students in DC. So we exceeded the goals in our first 3 years and continue to reach more students. What we're also really proud of is depicted in this map on the slide. The red dots on this map are the locations of private tutoring. If a parent or family member or student were to go into Google and look up tutoring, private tutoring, those red dots would come up, and they are all clustered in our higher resourced neighborhoods we call wards in DC. The blue dots show you where OSSE, our state education agency, has funded high impact tutoring work over the past 4 years. And so you can see that we've equitably distributed access to really high quality evidence-based tutoring in the district. Next slide, please. So when we talk about value, here are some of the ways that we are seeing the value of high impact tutoring in DC. First, we've been able to increase the dosage or the number of sessions that our students receive year over year. The reason why this is so important to us is because there is a lot in the research that tells us that the more sessions students receive, the better the outcomes you get. So this was a real big focus for us for our tutoring programs. And you can see here that most of the facts on this page, we cite a study that we did in partnership with the National Student Support Accelerator. I just want to mention them. They're out of Stanford, and that was really important to the sustainability of our work to have this study done that shows us what our outcomes look like for high impact tutoring programs in DC, and that we can promote to key stakeholders to make sure they know the value that we're seeing in those programs. So moving to the second outcome, in academics, we see that students who participated in high impact tutoring programs that were funded by the city narrowed the achievement gaps between their non-tutored peers on most interim assessments. We also saw that HIT improves attendance in DC, and that was, we see a direct impact on increased attendance, which was really exciting as attendance is something that we are that is a focus area in DC. There's a lot of challenges with chronic absenteeism here and across the country. And finally, wanted to mention that something that came out of our high impact tutoring work that wasn't necessarily planned for is that we're seeing it really has stoked the teacher pipeline. In DC, a lot of our tutors, when when you put a lot of adults in front of kids to do meaningful work, they become interested in staying there. And we're seeing that time and again, and a lot of tutors are becoming classroom teachers. So next slide, please. Now I want to kind of get into the cost piece of how we think about our high impact tutoring program, because it is so important and it is something that we've put a lot of strategic thought into. As you can see, we were able to lower the cost to the state for high impact tutoring fairly dramatically from the first 3 years of our program to last year and then continuing in this year. Again, this is the cost to the state. I know when Matthew and when Dr. Steinberg and Dr. Storey were talking, they're talking big picture about the costs overall of high impact tutoring work, but it's really important from our position to consider how can we lower our costs, and then we also think about how we can lower the costs of HIT overall. The way we were able to do this is by really analyzing our data, really understanding our programs, and constantly improving not only the programming but also the requirements around our programming. So, and the way we gave out funding. So in the first 3 years, we funded high impact tutoring work in the district by directly issuing grants to tutoring providers. What we learned over time is that when we did a cost analysis of all the high impact tutoring work happening across the district, is that another way of implementing high impact tutoring programming is to have schools and local education agencies run it themselves, and that method of delivering high impact tutoring can be less expensive. And so we realized it was really important to provide an opportunity for our LEAs, our local education agencies, and our schools to, if they had the capacity, run their own in-house programs, in addition to funding tutoring providers so that schools without the capacity could access those. So instead of continuing to fund only tutoring providers, in last year and moving forward, we actually are funneling most of our funds to the local education agencies, where they can make the decision if they want to run in-house programs that tend to be more cost-effective here in DC, or lower cost in DC, or they want to work with a provider. They can make that choice. Additionally, we found that schools and local education agencies that did contribute some funding to their program tended to have greater buy-in in the implementation of their programs than when it was fully funded for them. So this was a learning as we in our observations of the work on the ground. And so what we decided to do is cap the per student amount of funding at a reasonable level, and say that anything more would have to be covered by our local education agencies. Now, that not only creates the potential for that fiscal buy-in, but it also encourages everyone to really think about costs and maybe innovate to find ways to deliver the programming at lower cost. So in FY25, our our funding was $1,000, or the way we issued funding was $1,000 per student for 20 weeks. Someone asked a questions about the length and of programs and that cost differing amounts. Here in DC, we really encourage at least 20 weeks of programming, and then a little less at $800 per student for 16 weeks. So so next slide, please. So this last slide just lists a few of the different ways we are thinking about sustainability in the district and the ways we are planning for it, and the things we believe we have to prioritize. And first and foremost is to set up and continue really robust data collection and analysis so that we can understand our program, not only to continuously improve it, which is a hallmark of this program. We are constantly iterating. We are constantly identifying ways to make it either more effective or lower the cost, and hopefully both. And but also to continue to promote high impact tutoring, because it's not only you that needs to see the value, it's everyone who makes the decisions around funding that needs to see the value of the program. And we've found that time and time again, how important, the release of the reports from our research partner are to the continuation of receiving funding. That brings me to our prioritization of continuing to partner with researchers to produce evidence that not only informs our work, but also moves the field forward. We learned so much from the research that is happening in other states and other districts, and we very often adjust our programming and our strategy in accordance with what we're learning. We also want to contribute to those learnings, and we will do that at every turn. And that goes hand in hand with the data collection, the importance of collecting data. When we do study our programs, we try to always think about cost and cost analysis, and we're really excited to use tools like the ones that my co-panelists have discussed earlier. And then we also always want to be mindful of pairing our quantitative data stories with insights from folks who are really on the ground. You said I'm on the ground. I'm not fully on the ground. It's the folks doing the work that are in the classrooms with the kids, and who are the students, who are the families of the students, and who are the school leaders. So they're seeing so much impact happen that can't be necessarily captured in data. And so it's really important to share the stories and the insights that they have to continue the programming. And then finally, I've extracted tremendous value out of having strong partnerships with other states, with other districts, with schools, with funders. I've learned so much from the folks on this call, also in a state fellowship program that I'm a part of, and just talking to others in the same position, because it is navigating this funding landscape is really tricky. And bottom line, whether we get costs down or not, this is a fairly resource intensive program, and it's important to continue funding it when we're seeing these strong results. And we need a lot of minds put together to figure out how to do that. So yeah, we're looking forward to leveraging all these strategies and more to continuing our work in DC.
Thank you, Jess. I mean, thanks for sharing your insights and the work happening in your district from you and your team on impact, value, sustainability. I appreciate you sharing that with us today. So we've received a few questions before, and I know we just have a few moments left. If you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll do our best to get to it. But I will start with at least one of the questions we received beforehand. So if you want to jump to the next slide. So we had a question: if you had to give district leaders one piece of advice for making tutoring investments count in a post-ESSER world, what would it be? So Dr. Steinberg, let's start with you, and then I'll have other panelists jump in if they want to offer their perspective as well.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks to the panelists for, I think, a really important discussion. Jess has heard me say this before, and I think districts play a critical role in not just using information, right? And using data on whether a program has an impact on student learning or the cost associated with the program, right? But actually partnering and leading on the production of evidence, right? Because we know that the only places that we can generate authentic evidence on whether interventions work happens to be in schools. And so, again, I think if I were to give advice to district leaders, it would be continue for those who are doing it, continue to do the great work that you're doing to partner with researchers, partner with providers, partner with organizations like Accelerate to build evidence to help inform decisions that you and your school leaders and school partners are making as you're looking at the landscape of tutoring providers and trying to identify which of those providers meaningfully increases student learning and can do so at the greatest return on the dollar. So again, my advice would be, districts are not passive recipients of evidence. Districts play a critical, if not the critical role in enabling the conditions by which we produce evidence to inform those school and district-based decisions.
And then, Dr. Stone, we actually had one question come in the chat. I think it's a clarifying question for you. The high dosage tutoring cost range per pupil is for what dosage or length of time? Is that per year?
That's a great question. I see Alexis Daniels, a great question. So that $1,000 to $3,000 per pupil of high dosage tutoring that I cited is across a range of different programs. So these could be programs that are semester long, year long. They could be in person. They could be virtual. The dosage likely varies, across those programs. So I think that's a key question because what I think underlines that question is what are the program details of each of these interventions? And again, that question brings up the key point around why we need to know the cost and the return on investment, because we really want to understand, are there certain models, whether these are semester long, year long, virtual, whether they leverage paraprofessionals or certified teachers, right? How those different program models might generate differential impacts on student learning and ultimately different returns on investment. Hopefully that answers the question.
Great. So we have another question. We can jump to the next slide. So we've heard a lot about effectiveness and value. How should districts balance research-based practices with the practical realities on the ground? So Jessica, I feel like this is the perfect question for you if you want to start, and then again, certainly others can jump in.
Yeah, this is a great question. A lot of our work in more the past year has been around how can we support schools and providers to implement high impact tutoring with fidelity to the research because it is really hard. It's really, really hard work. So, and that's I think where what we are really focused on now that we've gotten to the scale in DC and the ways in, first and foremost, like if you can't, we have 7 standards for high impact tutoring in DC. We've named, that's how we define high impact tutoring, and they're all grounded in research. If you start off at a school, we say, and you can hit 6 of them, like that's great. We'll work on the next one. This is an iterative process. We are constantly learning, and we and it's important to in the early stages be patient and understanding it might not come all together all at once. At the state level, we are really doing our best to provide technical supports on the exact topics that folks on the school level need support in. So we've done a lot of qualitative data collections to understand that scheduling is a really tricky piece of implementation process. So we've contracted with folks who specialize in scheduling to support our schools with that process. We do a lot of program observation so that we can problem solve on the ground with schools. So that's not necessarily, it doesn't mean it's going to be perfect right off the bat every time or even by the end of the year, but our goal is to just get better and better and better and to be thought partners with schools and to allow schools to be thought partners with each other. We also have communities of practice here in DC where LEA and school leaders can get together and tutoring providers can get together to talk about the issues that they're facing so that we can get as close as we can to doing what's best for kids.
And then I think we have one more question, just because it's actually a good jumping off point from the response that you just gave. So the next question that we have is, what signals should districts look for to know a tutoring program is working, not just in data, but in day-to-day implementation? So Jessica, it'd be great to have you sort of start this, 'cause I think it's an extension of what you just talked around with implementation and scheduling. But then Nathan, it'd be good to get your perspective to round this out around some of the data as well. So Jessica, we'll start with you.
Yeah, another great question. I think, I am going to go back to data to start it out. It's not just looking at assessment data. What we found is looking at attendance, session level attendance data on a very regular basis is key to ensuring that the implementation is at least structured well and is heading in the right direction. It's not everything, but you have to have kids there to make an impact. So we are not just looking at outcome data at the end. We are looking at um, how many times our students are attending sessions, and we're trying to it's very hard to get that data and to analyze it quickly, but we're getting better at better and better at looking at it in more regular intervals. Because if you wait, 3 months to talk to the school or provider about their attendance data, then you've wasted a lot of time that students could be, where you discover that tutoring is scheduled, at the same time as all the sports after school. So what's happening there is we need to find a different place for it, whatever it might be. You can't wait till it's too late to learn about it. And the other thing I'll say is talking to folks in schools and getting their feedback, including teachers, understanding how teachers are seeing your high impact tutoring program is going to tell you a lot about it. We got a lot of tough feedback about some of our programs in DC that is leading to a lot of changes because they can see if their students are making progress when they come back in their classroom. And if they don't know what's going on in the tutoring sessions, then there's an opportunity being missed in the implementation. So that's, I would say, talk to folks in schools and especially don't forget the teachers, and also to look at that attendance data on a regular basis.
Absolutely. Nathan, anything that you would like to add to that as well?
Yeah, so just you hit it exactly on the dot in terms of the data. The attendance is one of the most important factors. And the one piece I would add to that is, and you were touching on this a little bit as you were talking about how sometimes the tutoring might line up with sports in the afternoon. There's a conflict, so they're not coming to the tutoring, is having the data not when possible. And that, as she said, data is really hard to get for attendance and to then look at it in real time and use it. But having data about not just whether students were attending, but if there's reasons why they were or why they were not attending. Some of our studies have found that many of the reasons for students' absences from tutoring programs may be due to things that are not actually out of in their control. It could, or things that are due to the student themselves being sick, for instance. They can be due to school half days and professional development days in schools, and if the tutoring program is aligned with sports or other school events that conflicts. So having not just the attendance numbers, but also having that, putting it together with reasons why they may or may not be attending is really useful to see and for us to understand if a program is working or changes need to be made to the structure of the program. In addition, as you're talking about talking to the people on the ground, having this time to talk to teachers, but also to the tutors themselves who are implementing, whether they are teachers or paraprofessionals or students from a nearby college or other school, having them talk about the experience of working with the students, having them talk about the experience of working with the tutoring intervention and the structure, the curriculum, the materials, gives a lot of really key insights into whether the program is working and engaging students and bringing them into the learning.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, I think as a provider, it really resonates with me. I mean, just the strength of that implementation and just constant and open communication plays such a huge role. So certainly appreciate that. I believe we've probably gone a few minutes over, but I really appreciate the conversation, the questions. I want to thank our expert panelists today for their time and insights. Thank you for sharing that with us. For our attendees, thank you for your time and participation. I know if we go to the next slide, I know we have some information where you can just learn more about the other series we've done or more information about Tutor.com. We've also put links into the chat that our panelists referenced today where you can get more information about the research or the value that we spoke about. So this session has been recorded, so feel free to share it with colleagues. Again, appreciate everyone's time and have a wonderful day. Thank you.